All right, we're going to get started. Again, my name is Ayannah Kamryn, and I am the moderator for this session today. This is a lightning talk series about the science of storytelling. We're really excited to have you, and we hope that you have been enjoying BPHL, whether this is your first event or if you have even been a part of the conference last year. We're definitely excited to have you and to be celebrating innovation with a purpose. So we're really excited for this talk, and we have some amazing speakers lined up to share their perspectives on the topic. But before I introduce them, I definitely want to make just a couple of notes before we get started. One being that your cameras as the audience is not on. So we can't see you, but you'll be able to see all of the speakers as they present, as well as you can use the chat box feature during this time to communicate for any comments, any questions, anything like that. Definitely feel free to use that. Secondly, there will be time for a short audience Q&A at the end of the session. So all speakers are going to come up and they're going to present. And then at the end, we'll make time for all questions and answers. So feel free throughout the talks to be dropping things in the chat, all of your questions, and I'll make sure to save them for the end. There is a Q&A feature for specific questions. It's a little question mark that you should see in the corner. So feel free to drop your questions there, and I'll be sure to save them and read them out loud to all of the guests towards the end. Also, we do have a lot of people tuning in today, so if we don't get to all your questions, please don't feel sad, but we'll make sure that we get to as many as possible during this conversation. As well as if you so happen to lose internet connection during the session, just feel free to exit your browser and then come back on when you get connected again. All right, I'm excited to introduce our speakers because we have a really good conversation lined up. Today, each speaker will be talking about the science of storytelling. So please join me in welcoming Quentin Williams, who is also known as Quentin the Poet, as well as Peter W. Singer, who is a strategist at New America and a professor of practice at Arizona State University, as well as Geoffrey Klein of Nine Dots. So first, we're going to start with Quentin, and then we'll be able to kick it off to everyone else. Quentin, I'm going to pass it off to you. Quentin, you're muted. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
All right, great. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm really happy to see some familiar names in the chat. I see TU's definitely representing, and you're absolutely right. We always are super obnoxious for no reason at all, but I love it. I've had a really intense week, so excuse me for looking down. I would have loved to have been off script for you. But today, I'm really excited to talk to you about the science of storytelling. My topic is designing delicious delights. We'd wake up at 4:30 a.m. on fishing days, then go out to the old canal and fish by the natural stream that ran parallel to the man-made canal lake. When I first learned what time we had to wake up, I could have swore I was going to hate fishing. But as it turned out, they were some of my favorite days of the summer. Grandma, she would make all these sandwiches and put them in Ziploc baggies and stack them neatly into the refrigerator for my dad, my 4 siblings, and me. We'd always bring extra to share in the communal ice cooler with snacks, soft drinks, and jerky for our cousins. My Uncle Earl taught us all how to fish. With his enormous war veteran arms, tanned and toned, he would hoist us up over the wooden fence by the cow pasture until we were old enough to climb it on our own. And that's where I found myself, right there, in the wild wheat that grew as tall as me. Away from the light pollution of New York City, we can see so many stars, the Big Dipper and the Milky Way. We wandered amidst the smoky moose, nostril blown through huge bovine silhouettes, backlit by the lingering, low-hanging moon. Still surprises me when people say that fishing is boring. Back then, the gang of us were all riotous with laughter, then deliriously sunbaked with fatigue by the end of the day. We'd save our best stories like acorns, sometimes for entire winters, just to be able to engage in the volley of storytelling that would ensue over the course of the day under the summer sun. The best storytellers were celebrated for the nostalgia that they were able to evoke in those moments, firing our shared times into memory in the kiln of collective consciousness. For the first time in my life, me, a suburban boy, was transplanted into the wild Catskills. Did I wonder about the life contained in each leaf of grass? About rivers full of wriggling sheephead, wide-mouthed bass, bluegills, and our dreams? About the future and our place in it? The mysteries began to open up and whisper to me in a way that an aptly named book title might pillow talk to a lover of stories. Impressions swallowed whole and unconsciously, depositing wisdom like seeds buried deep into the soil of my subconscious. There is an art to storytelling, of course, but there is also a science. Think of how cooking is, in a way, a combination of chemistry and artistry. Words, sentences, and paragraphs are the guests we invite to our dinner parties of our stories. If letters are the people who live in our towns, then words are the towns of our countries. Stories have the power to create worlds within our minds. We can decorate our inner worlds with emotions, be they pleasant, thrilling, sensual, suspenseful, dark, depressed, joyous, adventurous. Sometimes the sentence will jump right out of the water and straight into your bucket, baited by inspiration or a visit by pure benevolent creative genius. Other times you'll have to try again and again to get your hook into the sentence like a slimy, wiggly worm, still full of life in the coolness of the morning air. And once you finally hook it, you cast your sentence back out there into the stream of consciousness. As fog rolls back and the sun emerges above the trees that frame your field of consciousness, waiting for the next wild sentence to bite. And sometimes your sentences come together in gregarious warmth, like the hugs and kisses given at the first fish fry at the end of a global pandemic. They come together the way that people do when bound by a strong cord of familiar ties or patriotism. They come together and create memories and a shared photo album of a different sort. The choice of word and sentence structure can be the difference between bargain brand and fair trade, free range, organic happy words. And perhaps happy words like happy cows and happy vegetables taste better when they're spoken to and sang too often. Precise words, nuanced and layered sentences, slow food made with love, meant to be savored, aged for the perfect taste and texture, beautifully plated, delicate, placed in front of you with intention to deliver a full sensory masterpiece. If there is a science to words, then it is this. You must blend together your word ingredients to make meals that are more than merely palatable. Our editing process will need our words like bread dough that rise and fall with the rhythms of reality, allowing the yeast of your magic to work its way through the receiver. Words are your ingredients like wild wheat. Your hand pounds them into coherence like flour. Sentences are recipes guiding the receiver to mix in warm water, yeast, salt, sweetness, butter, and cracked pepper for savor. And paragraphs are your sentences. Paragraphs are your sandwiches, sliced and leveraged as vehicles for the theme. Themes are your fish, spirited, lively, and delicious once scaled, filleted, and seasoned. Sandwiched between your paragraphs, a few shakes of hot sauce, tartar if that's your thing. Devoured quickly so the words don't become too saturated with the oils of your theme. Savored for the minutes, days, and years that follow. Maya Angelou once said that I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. So over the course of devouring your next story, you might just know why the caged bird sings, or what happens when you kill a mockingbird, or the true power of a notebook. Regardless of whether you are delivering a keynote speech, a business presentation, a eulogy, or a bedtime story. You can intentionally design your story meals to create the chemical environment for your message to resonate beyond its surface meaning to simply sustain us. Your story is your fish fry, a meal made memorable by those whom you share it with. You can design your stories intentionally to weave hearts together. So I encourage you to design delicious delights. What will your next story taste like? Thank you.
Thank you, Quentin. Let's give it up for him. A virtual clap. We see claps in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was amazing. I definitely have questions about it. I hope that everyone who has questions or comments about Quentin's poem, that definitely save them until the end, or feel free to drop them in the question box, and we will be able to address them at the end of the session. Next, I'm going to bring up our next speaker, Peter W. Singer, who's the strategist and professor of practice at New America and Amazonian State. Peter, I give it to you.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be able to join you remotely, and I lament that I'm not being able to be there in person. I'm going to try and see if we can bring some visuals into this, which is another part of storytelling. And the starting point for this is actually a research project that my partner and I began several years back, and we were exploring what we believe to be one of the most important science and technology stories of not just our day, but maybe overall human history, the emergence of artificial intelligence and ever more autonomous robotics. I mean, think about it this way. Over the last generation, these technologies that had been in science fiction have become real. We're on the 19-year anniversary of 9/11. On the military side, the forces that went into Afghanistan had 0 unmanned systems. Today, the U.S. military has over 22,000 of these robotic systems in it. On the civilian side, AI has gone from the imagination of Arthur C. Clarke in 2001 to a real technology that's disrupting fields that range from medicine to finance. It has an annual impact on the economy of $33 trillion. And yet, if we're headed into what's been excitingly called a new industrial revolution, my sense is we've got 3 really big questions to work out. The first is, what is the impact of this on jobs, the economy, and broader society? So, for example, a study from Oxford University looked at 702 different jobs and found that over the next 20 years, 47% of total U.S. employment is at risk for replacement or reduction by robotics and AI. So that leads to a massive effect on both individuals, businesses, regions, you name it. The second issue is new technologies lead to new questions of law and ethics. And we also have new kinds of law and ethics questions that we've never seen before. Basically, they break down into 2 types. One is machine permissibility. What should these tools, these technologies, be allowed to do out there on their own? We've never had to ask that before. The second is machine accountability. Who should be responsible for these tools and what they do? Who gains from it? Who faces the consequences if something goes awry? And what's so fascinating about it is these questions play out everywhere from our highways to the battlefield. And you think about the implication of something like face recognition technology, which has been used by everyone from police forces to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And that leads to the third big question, which is basically we get a new series of issues in security and privacy that we've never wrestled with before. Where, for example, face recognition technology, it's not just about matching you to an identity, it's about connecting that to all the data in the world. Everything that you've bought, posted online, everything that your friends and family have done, and then using that to connect it to influencing and predicting your behavior. And all of this, it's only going to go faster because of the coronavirus pandemic. These trends were already in place. Now they're being sped up. So we took that research and had a big question. How do you share this with people? How do you help people understand it? And so we built a new way of going after it that we call useful fiction. It's the combination of nonfiction research and narrative. So we took that research and packaged it within a novel. So it's a story, it's a techno thriller, but packed into it are over 300 explanations and predictions of everything from how does AI work to how is it going to be used by the police, by Starbucks, by the military, you name it. And it's not just packed in, it comes with, just like in a nonfiction story, 27 pages of research endnotes to document how it's drawn from the real world. So we think of useful fiction as a little bit like trying to sneak veggies into a smoothie, but for leaders and for the public. And just like those earlier 3 issues, we think there's 3 reasons for the value of this concept. One is narrative is better for conveying complex ideas. It's basically that stories, they're the oldest communication technology of all. We were using stories when we were gathered around a fire. PowerPoint, it's only 30 years old. The second is narrative provokes emotion. And as everyone from politicians to used car salesmen know, emotions are what lead to action. And then finally, narrative is more likely to be shared with others. No one ever suggested a great PowerPoint to read on your next vacation. No one ever connected over a white paper the way they do over a movie that they had a shared love of. And that's what's been so exciting about this project, is that we have used it not just as a manner to share information about AI, but also as a test of this case of useful fiction. And so far, the results have been pretty remarkable. The book came out this summer. And besides being able to talk with it, people remotely in Philadelphia, we've been able to talk with it to groups that range from the CIA to the Royal Air Force to Wall Street traders. And it's a novel, or maybe we got in there because it's a novel. We've even been invited to use this tool of useful fiction for other organizations that range from the Congress to the US Air Force, teaching military officers to use the power of story to convey their ideas in a more effective manner. And so in closing, with all the change that's going on around us, especially in technology, shouldn't we change the way that we share our important work too? So thanks very much for allowing me to share that with you.
Thank you, Quentin. Virtual claps, virtual claps. I love the analogy of useful fiction being like vegetables in a smoothie. I have a 3-year-old sister who hates vegetables, but she loves smoothies. So definitely we'll be looking for some questions and some commentary on that. Next, we're going to bring up Geoffrey Klein as our next speaker, who is the president and CEO of 9dots. Geoffrey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I have a question for all of you, and it's really, as we delve into the science of story, the question is whether or not you're aware that you're suffering from a pandemic. I know we're talking about the pandemic that we all know about, but I actually would hold true that we are all suffering from 2 other pandemics beyond the one we all know about. And they are infobesity and short attention spans. So let's look at the first, infobesity. So every year, this company puts out what happens in an internet minute. So 1 minute online. Now, rather than trying to read all that, I'm going to highlight some of them for you. So in 1 minute, there's over 1 million logins on Facebook, almost 5 million videos are viewed on YouTube, almost 200 million emails are sent, and 4 million Google searches in 1 minute. So we're being bombarded with information all the time. In fact, IBM did a study where they found that 90% of all the data that's been created was created in the last 2 years. So we are suffering from having so much information we don't really know what to do with. At the same time, we all are suffering from short attention spans. So they did a study, and back in 2000, the average human attention span was 12 seconds. The attention span of a goldfish is 9 seconds. Today, the average human attention span is 8 seconds. Let that sink in. That is, if you're still paying attention. But humans have a shorter attention span than that of a goldfish. So we have this huge problem where we've got way too much information and we can't pay attention. So coming to this webinar, I'm sure you know the answer, the treatment, the cure for these two pandemics is very easy. Tell a story. Tell a story. All right, well, I'm going to tell you a story. So this is the story that really should help you understand why story matters. And I sometimes refer to it as the brain story, as you'll see in a minute. And it has to do with a neuroscientist named Professor Uri Hassan, who at the time was doing research at Princeton. Now, Professor Hassan is an expert in communication and brain chemistry. And he wanted to see what the difference was in terms of how your brain behaved depending on what input it took in. So I really wanted to understand how an audience responded depending on what input they consumed. So he had two groups, and what he determined was that communication is all about brain chemistry. So here's the experiment that he did. He had two groups. One audience was given information, facts, figure, data. And then the other group was told a story, a narrative. Now, the first group that was given information, all these facts and figures, all the data points, sometimes referred to as death by PowerPoint, two parts of their brain activated, the vernix area and the Broca's area. Now, these two parts of your brain are super important. They are actually responsible for decoding meaning so that you understand the words that are being told to you. But funnily, the other group, the other audience that was told a narrative, their brain chemistry was very different. Not only did the Broca's and vernix area activate, but so did all these other parts of the brain. And in fact, it was the parts of the brain that the audience would use if they were experiencing the activity of the story. There's a phenomenon known as neural coupling. And it's that when a speaker and a listener, when a speaker's telling a story, the brain activity of the speaker and the listener mirror one another. So that if I told you a story about me kicking a ball, your motor cortex would activate. If I told you a story about sweet-smelling baked cookies, your olfactory cortex would activate. Now, there's also a rise in two hormones, cortisol and oxytocin, when someone's being told a story. I don't know if you're aware of what these two are. You can answer in the chat if you know cortisol or oxytocin. They're two fairly powerful hormones. Anyone want to have a guess? Cortisol, oxytocin, stress and pleasure. Perfect. Who was that? Casey. Excellent job. So I refer to them as the stress hormone and the love hormone. Now, why is that important in terms of communication? Well, I just told you about the pandemic we're having with infobesity and short attention spans. So one of the struggles we all have is getting people's attention. By having an increase in cortisol, the stress hormone, it makes you alert. It grabs your attention. Consequently, something that Peter referred to is the emotional connection. When you tell a story, you're tapping into people's emotions, and therefore you're making a deeper connection with them. So what was the results of Professor Hassan's research? Well, here's what he found out. As a result of the chemistry that occurs in your brain, there's actually an increase of 20 to 40% in both understanding and retention of what you're sharing than if you were simply to give them the information. So the story gives you that lift because of the way that our brain works. Therefore, it's real simple. If you want to have effective communication, just remember that story matters and the science proves it. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Virtual clapping, virtual clapping. Thank you so much to everyone, to all of our presenters. We've definitely talked about a lot, and I think someone mentioned this in the chat that you've all hit storytelling from very different perspectives. So now I'm going to open it up to the audience to give some questions. I did see a couple in the chat that I will definitely read out loud. But if you have come across any questions that you would like to share, definitely feel free to drop them in the chat as we're doing a Q&A now in this time. One question that I'm going to pose to everyone, based on you all doing such different takes on storytelling, how can we use storytelling with each other more right now during quarantine, where many of us are feeling so disconnected from humanity? Anyone wants to take a stab at it? Quentin, go ahead.
I'll hop right in there. So that's a fantastic question. The company that I founded, We the People Stage, focuses on storytelling as a modality for connection and building community. So very much to the point that Peter and Geoffrey hit on is that there is real science to the way that our brains process story, which actually helps to map our synapses together and have shared experience. So part of what I tried to demonstrate in the story that I shared with you was a sense of taking maybe an unexpected character into unexpected places and what will happen if you share that experience. So I've been wanting to have a summer this entire pandemic. I haven't felt as though I had a summer. So what better way to feel as though I'm traveling somewhere and having a vacation than to reminisce? And so I wanted to offer that same experience to all of you as the listener, as the audience, and us to journey there together. And so with the power of words and using as descriptive of words as I could and trying to paint a picture that wasn't just my experience internally, but also the experience that I was having in community with my brothers, sisters, and cousins and dad, was a offering of a small mental vacation to also demonstrate that words can be transformative. They can evoke emotion. I think that both, Geoffrey definitely spoke a lot to the chemical, like the science behind it. I think that's pretty cool. That I hit on some, creating the chemical environment. Geoffrey actually told you what some of those chemicals are. So I think that stories can be super powerful in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you, Quentin. Either Peter or Geoffrey want to take a stab at that question, how we can be able to use storytelling right now during quarantine when we're feeling so disconnected?
I'll jump in with two ways. One at a sort of micro level, and then the other on some big societal issues. On the micro level, we're having a video conference back and forth. And if you're like me, you have these all the time in your different workplaces and schools. And a practice that I've found useful and I think is important is trying to create a shared experience at the start of it to connect people in a very different kind of way. And it, the power of story is it paints a scene and it drops someone in that scene. And so like as a little example of that, there was a session I was at today that was a work meeting, but it began with having each person share about what background noise are they using to knock out all the real background noise in our lives that gets in the way. So people talked about everything from the music they played to someone talked about they've got recordings of crickets that they use to take them to a different place of the lake. And it was a way of both personalizing and allowing each other into our worlds and connecting in a very short, and then we went on to the meeting and it had a very different vibe on it. The power of story, though, is it also, as said, it allows you to not physically be in someone else's shoes, but in sort of small ways feel the effect of it. And I think that is incredibly important when we think about all the challenges of post-George Floyd, social unrest, and you name it. And I think story has been a very powerful way for sharing the experiences that people have living within different worlds. So I'm a parent, and hearing from people talking about, for example, having the talk with their kids, which is not something that I had as a parent. And it creates a point of connection that is so powerful in both personalizing something, but also connecting it to larger social issues. And so it's a very, as opposed to just a pure statistic about harm, putting it in a powerful, personalized story gives it so much more effect that I've found.
I agree. Thank you, Peter, for sharing. I'm going to kick it off to another question in the chat. And Geoffrey, maybe you can answer this one. What pieces should we always include in our storytelling, especially when at work and trying to use influence?
So for me, this is an interesting question that I get a lot in terms of like, how do you tell the story that's going to be most compelling? And one of the things that I think businesses often get wrong when they're telling a story is they're telling a story about how great they are. You know, if you look at ads and you look at the stories that people tell, they're like, we're the best in this and we're great at this. And they forget what I believe is the most important part of a story. And I created something for my class I teach at Temple called the 11th Commandment. And so if everyone takes nothing away, just remember the 11th Commandment, which is to know thy audience. Because I think that's what matters. I could have the best story in the world, but if I don't understand who my audience is and connect to what their concerns are, who cares? Because people don't care about what you can do. They only care about what you can do for them. And so I think it's really important when you're telling any kind of story that you're considering who the audience is that you're speaking to and what matters to them.
Awesome. Peter, we have a specific question here for you. To some, a novel might seem counterintuitive when people say that they have no time and get so much information in small chunks. Why did your book work, and what have readers told you about it?
That's a great point, and it actually connects to what Geoffrey laid out on the science side as well, is that so by engaging these different parts of the brain, stories, if they're well done, if they're effective, both draw a reader in and keep them. One of the most important challenges as a writer is to keep the reader on the journey all the way to the end, right? And story does that; it draws you in. So you know, as I think about it this way, no one ever was at a meeting and yawned, and someone said, you know, why'd you yawn? And I said, you know, I was up late at night last night reading this white paper, and it was so good that it kept me up. It was a page turner. We'll say that about novels, right? We want to get to, you know, get to the next chapter, or we'll do that about movies, keep us up. So we deploy that in a way to share it. And that example that I just gave you of someone yawning in a meeting, the story I painted is actually a true story from what a 4-star admiral said at a meeting in what's called the Tank in the Pentagon. It's the Joint Chiefs of Staff conference room. And he told it to another admiral. And that's the other second power of story is connection. We connect over story. And so to echo what was said before, it's not just targeting your audience. Your audience then does the work for you. If they enjoy it, they like to tell other people about it. And we know that, right? Because we read something, we see something, we want to share it with someone else. And so that can be really well done. One last real quick thing to hit something that Quentin did so skillfully that I wanted to echo what Geoffrey said. It's not just the macro. The power of story is also in the details. It's that half sentence, that little detail, you know, when you mentioned the word, that's can be so powerful, and you can use that for nonfiction too. So for us, for example, just the clothes that someone wears in a scene is an indirect way of talking about climate change. Someone wearing shorts in March in this future set scene does it. So I just wanted to hit that because the details are so key in storytelling.
Absolutely, 1000%. The details are so important. Quentin, I'm actually going to throw a question at you. Do you do anything performing today that you normally wouldn't do, or is it the same in a virtual space?
Yeah, so I normally wouldn't read in my in physical space. I often do use a script as my foundation, so I have an orientation of where I want to take the story, but I ad-lib and improv a lot. And so being in a virtual space where I can't see anyone's expression, I do a lot of call and response. I grew up in a Baptist church, so, you know, that kind of comes natural to me. I tend to feed off of other people's energy. And I oftentimes in the physical space will make it a point to speak to as many people in the room prior to my storytelling or performance as possible. That way I can actually weave in some of those things that I've learned over the course of that, 20-minute prior to the performance into the actual performance to make it feel more live and make it feel more real and dynamic. So the virtual space is different, just because you don't necessarily have that sort of interaction. Even when people are off mute, the way that our systems work is that it's going to oftentimes sound cancel whoever is speaking if you try to do the call and response. So it's just a little different, thinking of things more so in respects to what's the experience that I can deliver now, and then, offer room for Q&A as opposed to more of that dynamic live interaction. So it's been an adjustment. Thank you for that question. I love that question.
Yeah, we're definitely all adjusting and pivoting in a lot of different aspects. Someone is asking a question in regards to storytelling for high school students. Any thoughts on how to make storytelling relevant for high school students? How to show them that their stories can help them make an impact on the world? So I'm going to open this up to anyone who feels inclined.
I have a couple high school daughters. So I have twin daughters that are in 10th grade. So I know that audience a little bit. And I think, again, going back to my point about knowing the audience, I think, that, again, it's about relating to what matters to them. So I think there's, when you're talking about the impact, there's lots of stories of how teenagers have impacted other teenagers or how have impacted other people or younger brothers and sisters. Teenagers, for all their craziness, also have a lot of power and are passionate, and all those hormones raging, and I see it in my children and the stories that they create. So I think it's about tapping into that, what's on their minds, what matters to them, and I think a lot of it is about asking questions, because I think one of the things about, in my experience with teenagers, is they're not often like to be told what to do. And so you have to kind of tease it out a little bit more. And I think by having thoughtful questions in different sessions, it will lead to them answering with stories. Can you tell me a time when you were scared? And so I think if you have it in little group sessions, there's ways to build on what other people say. So I think it's really important about the moderation of that, in terms of, again, teasing out and extracting from them, getting them out of their shell. Is definitely one way to try.
Absolutely. My mom used to tell me it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So she would say things to me in a particular way to get the answer that she wanted. Peter or Quentin, do you have any thoughts on that before we wrap up for that question?
I would just add, I try to be as mindful as possible on how stories can be repackaged. So most of my career I've worked in media, primarily in radio, but also a lot in digital spaces. And so with We the People stage, we also often want to think about ways that we can tag our stories for social media, ways that we can create moments that are tweetable and moments of sound bites that can be packaged into a 15-second Instagram story. So if I'm live and on stage and I shout out somebody's name who I spoke to in the audience ahead of time, and when I upload that clip on Instagram and tag that person, right? So I think that with younger audiences, although I don't have any high school students, I don't have any kids at all, but I do mentor students. I think it's really interesting to see how they react differently with story when they utilize devices that they're already comfortable with, devices that they might otherwise be tuning me out on if, I didn't proactively engage that. So I love the fact that Instagram calls it IG story, just looking at ways that they can leverage that for a purpose, for education, and for, achieving some of their goals is also really interesting.
I would just add, so it's interesting, we've done these training courses on using the power of narrative for real world effect, everyone from, mid-career Air Force officers to corporate. We haven't done it for students. My guess is actually it might be easier because they haven't kind of built up the barnacles the way someone in their 40s has already done. But much as you've seen today, there's sort of a cross between the science and the art of building a story, but there are sort of a series of rules that you follow in any kind of story building. And I think these would carry across very much for a high school audience. So you've heard some of them, know your audience. Who really is your target audience? It's not the entire world. There's someone in particular that you want to affect. And how do they look at it? Another one, for example, is the difference between the story and the theme, the lesson that you want to share. So, Moby Dick is not really the story of a hunt for a whale. So for you, students, okay, what is it you're really after? What are the underlying themes that you want that target audience to get? There's a series of these. And I think they would carry across really well with students. And part of it is also you do a scoping with the audience of what is it that you care about? What is the message that you want to share? You don't hand someone a story to tell. The best stories are created by people. And finally, working as teams. I think these lessons very much do apply over to any age audience.
Absolutely. Great advice all around. Thank you all for the amazing advice. And we've actually come to time today. So I'm asking maybe if you all, I know we didn't get to a lot of questions and people are actually asking personally for information. So if you all could possibly just drop any contact information in the chat, if anyone wanted to personally reach out and connect with you during the time. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we did have some really good conversation and some really good topics were brought up as well. And I believe that someone asked if these will be recorded. They will be recorded, and you can reach out to the BPHL team to get more information on how to access them. But I definitely want to thank and take time to thank both the audience as well as our speakers for coming on and sharing your personal stories, as well as how we can all use the impact of storytelling in our daily lives. I've definitely had a good time. So thank you all for taking the time and coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ayannah, for the
You're
wonderful
welcome.
job with hosting, and to our
Thank you for being an
amazing
awesome
event
moderator.
organizers.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see that you all are dropping some contact information in the chat. So anyone who is looking to possibly look for more contact information to reach out to Peter or Quentin or Geoffrey, please feel free to do so and do more due diligence of just making impactful stories. So thank you all. We have come to time, but definitely continue to be inspired by the innovation, continue to be inspired by storytelling. And the conference isn't over. There's still a couple more hours left. So enjoy the rest of the sessions that are coming up today. And I hope that everyone enjoyed this particular session as well. So we're going to log off for now, but everyone continue to enjoy the rest of the day as well as the conference. Thank you.
Peace.